Thank you, Chris, for that very kind introduction. That is the very first introduction I've ever had, a blah, blah, blah. Felt right at home. Let me begin by echoing those who have gone before in paying tribute to both Wycliffe and IGE in mounting this very impressive program. And I particularly would single out Chris's catalytic leadership in that, and the fact that he chose to include me in your deliberations. I do have one request, though, Chris. In the future, never position me after your father, even if there's a night between us. That is a very tough act to follow. And Bob, that was just a truly inspiring talk last night. Very grateful for that. Well, for more than a decade now, defense planners have been wrestling with the challenges of what's called an asymmetric threat. And what this term means is the creative out-of-the-box measures to which disadvantaged opponents resort in trying to do you harm, much like bin Laden did in 9/11 that rocked this country back on its heels. And I think that as you look at that threat, there is not enough money in the U.S. Treasury to protect us against the full spectrum of possible threats of an asymmetric nature. And I think what's really needed is a counter to that threat, an asymmetric counter that gets at the ideas behind the guns. Now, that's not as easy as it sounds, because there's a religious dimension to that threat. And as you look at our performance in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's pretty clear that we have very little ability to deal with religious differences in a hostile setting. Nor do we have any ability to counter demagogues like bin Laden who manipulate religion for their own purposes. And I find it supremely ironic that one of the most religious nations on the face of the planet is so incapable of dealing with the religious imperatives that permeate today's geopolitical landscape. And among the reasons, three stand out. First is our long-held commitment to the rational actor model of decision-making, in which religion was deemed to be irrational and therefore outside the policymaker's calculus. Second is the fact that we have used our separation of church and state as a crutch for not doing our homework to understand how other religions inform the worldviews and political aspirations of those who do not separate the two. And finally, there are the operational constraints that flow from that separation of church and state. Sadly, we have relegated religion so to the realm of the personal that whenever industry or even government hears the word religion, they typically run for the hills. All they see is downside of being accused of favoring one over another. And when you think about the looming specter of religious extremism married to weapons of mass destruction, it only makes more urgent the need to fill this gap. Well, one approach that gets at the ideas behind the guns that has showed unusual promise is a new form of engagement called faith-based diplomacy. What do I mean by that? Well, at the macro level, simply means including religious considerations into the practice of international politics. At the micro level, it sometimes means making religion part of the solution in intractable identity-based conflicts that exceed the grasp of traditional diplomacy. And since our center's inception in 1999, we have been practicing this faith-based diplomacy. And by the way, if you want any more details about that, there's a book that came out in 2003 that's the sequel to the first book that Chris mentioned, Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft. But this one's called Faith-Based Diplomacy, Trumping Realpolitik, and it goes into it in quite some depth. But we've been for the last 8.5 years wrestling with the challenges of Sudan, Kashmir, Pakistan, Iran, Syria, United States, most recently Afghanistan. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about several of those projects to illustrate how faith-based diplomacy gets brought to bear, and to say a little bit about how Jesus enters that equation. We first began in Sudan, and see if I got this. There we go. When I first shared the vision of this center at a Tuesday morning prayer breakfast that I attend, it's largely for ambassadors. It takes place at the Cedars, which is sort of the home base of the National Prayer Breakfast Fellowship. There present was a former political advisor to the president of Sudan, and he asked me if we could come to Sudan. He invited me to go there to see if there was anything that could be done to arrest the civil war that had been raging at that point for 16 years between the Islamic North and the Christian African traditionalist South. And when you're starting out something new and unconventional, like making religion part of the solution, you would, if you had any strategic sense about you, you would go for the low-hanging fruit, the easy ones, you know, to build your experience and reputation. But that was not our fate. We did go to Sudan, and all the doors opened, and all of a sudden it just became crystal clear what we had to do. And while there were a large number of non-governmental organizations working in Sudan at the time, they were primarily all focused in the south, dealing with the symptoms of the problem, trying to address the suffering that was taking place as a result of the conflict. And I think doing about as well as one could. We, on the other hand, chose to go to the north, to Khartoum, to see if we couldn't get at cause. And we deliberately set out to effect a strategy of establishing relationships of trust with the Islamic regime there, and to see if we, from that vantage point, could inspire them to take steps toward peace that they would not otherwise take. Well, about a year and a half into that process, we had a watershed moment in November of 2000, in which we brought 30 religious leaders and scholars together to discuss and figure out what to do about the religious aspects of the conflict. Now, 10 of these were prominent Sudanese Christian religious leaders, 10 were prominent Sudanese Muslim religious leaders, and 10 were internationals from both faith communities. The most difficult challenge about that was getting the Christians to participate. And I anticipated that that would be so, because they'd been beat over the head for so long that they were just totally cynical that anything good could come out of something like this. That was exacerbated by the fact that over the previous 10 years, the Khartoum regime had sponsored 3 major interreligious dialogue conferences involving lots of peoples from lots of countries, but nowhere along the line were the Sudanese Christians given an opportunity to air their grievances. When they attempted to do so, it was drowned out. So as far as they were concerned, it was just a PR bonanza for the government and not something very helpful to them. Well, after long-spirited discussions with them, I said, look, I can guarantee you there will be no PR. And I said, secondly, I said, you really don't have an option. You're a Christian. You're called to be a peacemaker. This is about making peace. You have to come, whether you want to or not. So they actually came with their heels dragging. And at the end of the first day, they came up to me with smiles on their faces, and they said, you know, this is the first time we've ever been heard. And by the third day, you had prominent Sudanese Muslim participants openly articulating the need to address some of the problems that they were hearing about for the first time. When it was all over, I had an elder statesman, Muslim, come up to me, and he said 2 things. He said, you know, this is the first time in the history of our country that Northerners and Southerners have spoken to one another from the heart. The second thing he said was that, you know, in his limited experience, which wasn't all that limited, he was quite old and he'd been a diplomat all his life, so he'd seen a lot come and go. But he said that he had never before seen such a concentration of intellectual horsepower in one meeting as existed on the Muslim side in that those deliberations. And that was not by accident. We weren't there to overthrow the regime. We weren't there to abolish Sharia or Islamic law. We were there to try to find credible answers to a very simple question. What steps can an Islamic government take to alleviate the second-class status of non-Muslims in a Sharia context? We thought if we could find credible answers, come up with credible answers to that question, and had highly credible Muslims around the table, that this could resonate in other parts of the world where there are similar tensions, like Nigeria and Indonesia. Well, when it was over, there was a genuine breakthrough in communications between the two communities. What started out in frosty silence ended with joking, even an air of camaraderie about it. And we came up with 17 consensus recommendations. I'll get to that in a moment, but one has to ask oneself, why was this meeting so successful when the wounds ran so deep? And I submit to you that a big part of the reason is it was truly an exercise in faith-based diplomacy. We began each day with readings from the Bible and the Quran. We proceeded each day with a prayer breakfast for the internationals and local religious leaders at the hotel. More importantly, we brought a prayer team from halfway around the world, Santa Barbara, California, all the way to Khartoum, Sudan, whose sole purpose was to pray and fast during those 4 days, praying for the success of the deliberations. When my vice president for training, who's an Episcopal rector in Santa Barbara, Brian Cox, called me with the idea and asked me what I thought of it, I said, Brian, I think it's a brilliant idea. I can't imagine that people who pray 5 times daily are going to get upset if we bring a prayer team. And they didn't. In fact, they were matched by a like number of Sudanese Pentecostals. And during the 4 days of those deliberations, you would see these folks coming in silently from the side, listening intensely, and then figuring out what needed praying for and going out and praying. All of this, of course, we took the breaks during the day for the prayer times for the Muslims, but all of this caused people to rise above themselves. And while the Christians bared their grievances just as baldly as you would hope, it was all done in a cordial tone from start to finish. And that was, it was unbelievable what that can do when you keep the emotion out of it. Another element in this faith-based diplomacy was in that year and a half leading up to the meeting, in my many discussions with the Sudanese foreign minister and the first vice president who ran the country, I get involved in what I'd call realpolitik discussions, trying to persuade them that what we were suggesting they do was in their own best interest, but always looking for the opportunity, that convenient opportunity to make a helpful reference to the Quran or how the prophet dealt with it or what Jesus might think about it. Now, I'll just digress for one moment here, but many in the West are pretty clueless about the deep degree to which Muslims revere the figure of Jesus. When you add up the explicit and implicit references in the Quran to Jesus, they number almost 100, far more than anyone else. He is thought by Muslims to be the only prophet without sin. He is thought to have powers that only God himself has and no other prophet. He's referred to at one point in the Quran as the breath of God. And although they don't believe he was crucified and resurrected, they do believe he's coming in the end time to sit in judgment. And even a splinter Muslim sects like the 12th Imam sect that President Ahmadinejad of Iran believes in, the 12th Imam returns with Jesus. So there's a huge amount of overlap there that can be usefully brought to bear. Well, among the 17 recommendations, one of those was to create an interreligious council, which we set about doing, and it took a couple years to do. It took that long to get the right people and the right relationships, and you know, one of the things that women know from birth and men sometimes figure out is all things are relational. and you need to get that right. But that's a council that meets monthly, and it involves the top Christian and Muslim religious leaders. And they surface and try to address their problems. But they also have as one of their tasks holding the government accountable for its religious policies. Now, that's what's kind of remarkable about this, is here you have an independent body. The context is an Islamic dictatorship, which not only permitted the establishment of this independent body, they also agreed to leadership for that body on the Muslim side, to which they were quite opposed. It took me 5 months to get them to buy that. But the leader we had was a gent who had been a pioneer in the Islamic movement in Sudan. But when the current regime took over in a coup in 1989, he became a constant critic, has a weekly column in the papers. He is so revered by both faith communities. He's the only one in Sudan who can criticize the president by name and not get thrown in jail. But we got him in there. And beyond that, the regime also agreed to take seriously the recommendations of the council. And Darfur notwithstanding, which is a Muslim-on-Muslim situation, I'm very encouraged by the fact that the government has met its obligations there to the tune of more than $500,000 in the form of land and funding to permit the building of new churches and to provide restitution for the past seizure of church properties. Now, I'll just mention in passing, because I would encourage you that when you read things in the media to kind of keep an open mind and just don't totally buy into what's you're being told, because it's something that runs totally counter to everything that the International Commission or the Commission on International Religious Freedom would tell you, or what the newspapers would tell you. I had in a group, I'm sitting there with the top Christian leaders of Sudan in the north, and they're telling me, they say, you know, we have no constraints on our ability to evangelize. What we can't do is we can't get permits to build churches. So the churches they have, we're going 24/7, you know, people are out in the courtyards and they're lifting the roofs of every house around with their singing. But it was really a constraint. There had not been a new church in Khartoum in the previous 25 years. So that was their problem. And that's what this council, one of the many things this council had been able to address. In fact, after just the first several months of that council's enactment, they had accomplished more in practical, concrete measures for non-Muslims than the churches had been able to do working by themselves for the previous 15 years. So it's, we sort of empowered them, if you will, to start doing the right thing. Well, I'd like to take you now to Kashmir. And, well, first, before I do that, this right here is a fellow, Enoch Tombey, who was the Secretary General of the Sudan Council of Churches. We worked together with them and with a group called the International People's Friendship Council, which was a Muslim organization. We always partner with an indigenous group when we go in, groups that command the respect and enjoy credibility with the very people that we're going to work with, so that we're not starting from ground zero. This gent right here is a fellow by the name of Hassan al-Turabi, who is thought to be the spearhead for militant Islam across all of North Africa and beyond. One of the most brilliant guys I have ever talked to in my life, and whenever I was in Sudan and when he wasn't in prison, because he was a competing threat to the regime there, I spent a number of hours with him. It was a really remarkable person, but and thought to be somewhat implicated in what's going on in Darfur at this point. Now, whoops, I had a couple of slides in there that on Kashmir, but we'll get to that in a minute. In Kashmir now, we've been there 7 years, and I hearken back to Bob's comments last night of how long it takes to be viewed as family, if you will. We've been there for 7 years. It's the only place that we've been where we were not invited in. And the only reason we went in there was because I felt like this is the nuclear flashpoint in the world today, and nobody's doing anything. Just nothing happening. Took a hard look at it and concluded that a top-down approach like we used in Sudan would not work there. There was absolute political gridlock at the top and no room for maneuver. So we went to the next generation leadership, folks like college professors, journalists, community leaders, those who were on the way up. And we sought to create a cooperative spirit between the Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhist regions of Kashmir. And this is the only project in which we have gotten beyond Islam as one of the competing religions there. And what we did is we used as our principal tool something called a faith-based reconciliation seminar. This is a creature of Brian's invention, our senior vice president who handles training. But what it is, it's a 3.5-day seminar where people have to go very deep about their own attitudes, their own perspectives, how those interact with others. And we purposely try to bring the transcendent aspects of their personal religious faith to bear in overcoming the secular obstacles to peace. And while I should just as a generic tell you that if we were ever thought to be proselytizing in any of the work we're doing, we would be totally dead in the water. We couldn't get anywhere. And a number of people who've come to these seminars have come with great suspicion that that's what we were up to. And those who come and are the biggest critics at the beginning usually end up as the greatest champions at the end of what it is we're doing. But we don't hide the fact that what we're really doing is teaching them the reconciling principles of Jesus. And foremost among those is the concept of forgiveness. Now, forgiveness on the face of it sounds very simple. It's not. It's anything but simple. And it's also the only way that one can ever hope to break the cycle of revenge, that causes one neighbor in Bosnia to do despicable things to his fellow neighbor because of something that happened 1,200 years ago. And when people come to understand that this forgiveness we're talking about is not so much about letting the other person off the hook, it's freeing oneself up of this burning need for revenge and the hatred that consumes, and passing that on to one's children and to one's grandchildren, and on and on and on. Well, we have conducted something like 10 of these in different parts of Kashmir. And I'll never forget when I was sitting there with a group of Muslims. This was our indigenous core leadership group that we formed after we got in there and had conducted a couple seminars. And sitting there at the table with them, at that point they were all Muslims, they were all male, and there were 15 of them. Now it's more like 25, and it includes women as well as men, and it includes all 3 religions. So we branched out, but you have to start somewhere. As I'm sitting there at the table, I can see the look of commitment in the folks' eyes around there. 3 of them had been highly placed in the Islamic militant movement. In fact, one of them had been the co-founder of that movement that had done some pretty despicable things. But one of the reasons they were with us was because of their disillusionment with the dead-end effects of violence. It had gotten them nowhere. But you could see that they were prepared to explore the possibility of faith-based reconciliation as a preferable paradigm to militant Islam or militant Hinduism. And 2 of these gents spoke up and said that after having attended 2 of the seminars, that each one said that he had now found his way clear to forgive perpetrators who had caused deaths of members of their immediate family. One of these gents, it was his son, and he had tears coming down his cheeks. So it was very real. And it blew my mind, frankly. I was thinking to myself, when you think of Islam, forgiveness is not the first characteristic that leaps to mind. And I was wondering how many of us Christians who purport to be about forgiveness could internalize it the way these gents had. And I'm not even sure that I can. until I've gone through that same walk, because the wounds are almost beyond one's ability to comprehend unless you've been in those moccasins. Anyway, we have essentially achieved our goals there in terms of the cooperative relationship. We had a bridge building meeting in Nepal, in a neutral location, brought people that we'd worked with from both sides of the line of control that separates Kashmir into Indian side and the Pakistani side. And they came out with a communique where all three religions subscribed to a mandate of items that were articulated and passed out on high. But we continue, we're still trying to search for how the formal peace process can capitalize on the goodwill we've been able to create at this next generation level. And we will persevere until we find just the right combination there. But so far we're making progress, but after 7 years one would hope one could say that. And let me move you on to Pakistan. Now, in Pakistan, we've been there for 4 years, reforming the madrasas, the religious schools that are famous for having given birth to the Taliban, among other things. And these schools have had a very illustrious history. Back in the Middle Ages, they were the absolute peaks of learning excellence in the world. It was only Western exposure to them that led to the creation of our university system. And things that you don't even think about, like funding a chair in a given discipline, or the mortar board and tassels that you wear at graduation, those all came out of madrasas. And unfortunately, over time, they regressed, and particularly under the impact of colonialism, and they sought to purge themselves of all disciplines that could be identified with the West, to the point where the majority of them today are about simply rote memorization of the Quran and the study of Islamic principles. Now, our goals there have been twofold. One is to expand the curriculums to include the physical and social sciences, but with a very strong emphasis on human rights, particularly women's rights, and religious tolerance. That has been going well, and I think even better has been the second goal, which is to transform the pedagogy, to create critical thinking skills among the students. When we first started out, if a young man so much as raised his hand in class, he could be punished for disrespect. It was very much just a one-way flow. And what would happen is you'd have youngsters, some as young as the age of 12, who have memorized the Quran from cover to cover, but really don't have any idea what it means, because they're memorizing in Arabic, their first language is Urdu, and they're not given near enough Arabic to understand something as sophisticated as the Quran. They're hardly given any. So what you have is these students, along comes the local militant who misappropriates the little scripture, as all religions are prone to do from time to time, and recruits these kids to their cause. And the kids are absolutely without any ability to challenge or question. And that's why the critical thinking skills become so important. Now, our success in this so far is stood in stark contrast to past attempts by the government of Pakistan to reform these schools. And largely because the madrasa leaders just are fearful of losing their independence, and they're fearful of the possible secularization of their curriculums. In the wake of 9/11, the U.S. government gave Pakistan $100 million for educational reform. The madrasas just thumb their noses at it. They're independently funded, most of them locally, but some get their funding from the Gulf. But for the reasons I just cited, they were not buying in. Now, why have we had success? For two reasons. One, we have been able to do this in such a way that the madrasa leaders feel it's their reform effort and not something imposed from the outside. So we give them a lot of ownership in the process. Sometimes that can be as simple as showing them good things and they ask for more. But secondly, we also appeal to their own heritage. We point out how many of the pioneering breakthroughs in the arts and sciences, including religious tolerance, took place under Islam 1,000 years ago. And the more they hear that, the more they internalize it, the taller they walk, and the more they start thinking, hey, maybe we can do better. You know? So right now, after 4 years, we've only really reached the tip of the iceberg, because though we've reached over 1,000 madrasas and 2,000 madrasa leaders, the rough estimates are there are somewhere between 12 and 15,000 of these schools around the country. Now, our numbers will grow significantly, because what we've been doing lately is training the more able participants in the initial workshops how to train others themselves. So we have master trainer workshops, and those folks are out there conducting one-day seminars and trying to focus on those aspects of the change that don't require additional resources to implement. And this particularly has to do with the transforming the pedagogy. This is just a picture of some of the folks at graduation getting their certificates from our workshops. This is our point of the spear. His name's Azhar Hussein. It's only half in jest that it says an American hero at the bottom, but he truly is a hero. He's not only American, but he's Shia as well. And I'll tell you, this is not friendly country for Shias. But we've learned how to finesse that until the relationships are strong enough that people can bear to learn who he really is. But he, just in 2006, he was a recipient, as James was in 2000, he was a recipient of the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding in New York. They have this Peacemaker in Action Award each year, and he was a 2006 recipient of that. He's a gent who grew up spent his youth in Karachi, attended a madrasa himself, is very fluent in Urdu. He shows incredible wisdom in dealing with the mindsets in the classroom over there. And some of these madrasa leaders are pretty tough cookies. And on top of all that, he's one of the most likable people you ever meet in your life. And that combination has just been unstoppable. As I said, we always partner with an indigenous partner. This gent in the middle here is our Deobandi partner. There's 5 sects that sponsor these schools in Pakistan. The 2 hardest line sects are the Wahhabis and the Deobandis. And the far most powerful of all the sects are the Deobandis. If there's 15,000 madrasas in Pakistan, 10,000 of them are Deobandi. And that's where the Taliban came out of. And he's our Deobandi indigenous leader. You can't see him here, but right behind Ozzy is our Wahhabi indigenous leader. So we have the 2 of them. Now I'd like to digress for a moment and start telling you some stories. Everybody loves a good story. About a year ago, I took 2 of our board members over to make presentations at several madrasas that had been openly identified with terrorism, and clearly identified. We had not been in those madrasas before, and the only way we got in there was through the interventions of our indigenous partners based on the credibility we had achieved with working with all the other madrasas. So we got in there, and the first one was a Deobandi madrasa outside of Karachi. It was known to be the chief supplier of fighters for Kashmir and Chechnya, and also had spawned the 2 most violent anti-Shiite terrorist groups. In fact, Ozzy and his wife both had cousins that had been killed by those anti-Shiite terrorist groups. We went in there, and there was a room full of madrasa leaders and madrasa administrators and senior faculty and Islamic scholars. And there was a lot of rage in the room because of U.S. foreign policy, but more particularly because it was at the peak of the Lebanon crisis, and everything Israel does we get credit for, so it was not a friendly audience. So I led off by saying, look, we're not a government organization, nor have we ever received any funding from our government. I said, and while the United States has clearly made some mistakes of late it's important for you to remember when they intervened on behalf of Muslims in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Somalia. I said, left untold in most recitations of Somalia are the more than 100,000 Somali lives that were saved as a result of the humanitarian aspects of that intervention. I said, and while you can clearly and justly accuse the U.S. of operating with a double standard in the Middle East because of its strategic relationship with Israel, I said, so too can you accuse the Arab leaders of operating with a double standard, who complain mightily of Israeli mistreatment, but then turn a deaf ear to Palestinian pleas for humanitarian assistance. So I said, everywhere you turn, there are double standards driven by perceived national self-interest. I said, but that's not why we're here today. See, I was just trying to cut through that rage. I said, why we're here today is to discuss values that we share in common. And then I quoted several passages from the Quran that I had committed to memory. A poor paraphrase blending of them goes like this: "O mankind, God could have made you one had he willed, but he did not. He made you into separate nations and tribes so that you may know one another, cooperate with one another, and compete with one another in good works." I said, I and my colleagues are here today to open the competition in good works. I said, the three of us happen to be followers of Jesus. And we know you can't be a good Muslim unless you believe some pretty wonderful things about Jesus. So let's ask ourselves, if he was standing in the room here today, how would he want us to interact with one another? And by the time this all played out, that rage had been actually converted to a spirit of fellowship. One thing that my project director told me later on, he said that in each place where we had done this, after the recitations from the Quran, he says, I could hear a collective sigh of relief. It was like the rage was dissipating. Simply because we'd gotten past tolerance. You know, tolerance means you're willing to put up with somebody. But when you get to respect, you know, then all the barriers come down. And they interpret as respect us having had the interest to learn about their values and what drives them and this sort of thing. We did, as I say, we did that in several places. The second place was a Wahhabi madrasa up near Lahore that had been identified with the London bombers. And the leader of that madrasa is a very large, imposing person, very respected and somewhat feared. And he's had occasion since I was there to interact 3 times with our project director. And each time he has said, you know, what your boss said about that question he asked, he says, it has moved me very deeply. It now causes me to ask myself every step of the way, what would the prophet have me do? You know? So after one of these sessions, one madrasa leader came up, smile on his face, smile on his eyes, you know, hands over his heart. He says, you have made me so very, very happy. He says, we thought all Americans hated us. And I'm thinking to myself, well, if they'd had any chance to look at the media in our country, it probably wasn't far off the mark. Another madrasa leader came up and said, this was kind of a very interesting situation. He said, you know, I have a situation in my village in which a young woman was caught talking on her cell phone at 2 in the morning to a young man in another village in whom she had an interest. And the village elders had deemed this to have violated their honor code. So they were the immediate reaction was that she was to die, her mother was to die, her sister was to die, the boy's mother was to die, and the boy was to lose his nose and his ears. It's very draconian. He said, ordinarily I would not intervene in something like this because these things happen. But I feel compelled, because of our discussions of human rights, to go and confront this on religious grounds. And it was not without some trepidation. He was fearful for what might happen to him. But he went there, he pointed out to the village elders how nothing in the Quran prohibited a woman from talking to a man. And he appealed to those passages that urged the peaceful resolution of differences. And he pulled it off. This situation was resolved and no one was hurt. Hopefully that can set a precedent for the village for the future and maybe surrounding villages. But it was a case where religion clearly trumped tribalism in a context where even Muslims can't tell you where one ends and the other begins. So an awful lot you hear about of a derogatory nature about Islam really has a lot more to do with tribal customs in certain areas than it does Islam itself. So these sorts of things are, provide a lot of encouragement. Well, in our first all-Wahhabi workshop, present amongst the participants was a Taliban commander of some renown. He was despondent. He'd lost 2 sons in the fighting, and he said, "We simply don't know what America wants. You come after us with guns, we have no recourse." So this then led to an invitation for me to come to the mountains and to apprise their senior leadership of what America wanted. So 2 months later I did, and I did go, and I tried to do my due diligence before I went to see what folks at Defense and State had to say about our objectives and what it was we wanted in Afghanistan. And I won't comment on how few people had any real idea of what we wanted. So I ultimately made it up. But I found myself in the mountains of Pakistan, in a place called Malakan Agency, and we're talking about up in this area here, and with 57 Taliban commanders and tribal and religious leaders. And I began that by saying, the reason we're here today is to see if we can craft a confidence-building measure that could point toward peace. He said, but for you to be able to participate in that, you need to understand the Western perspective on this situation. So then I told them what America wanted. And what I said was they want you to distance yourself from al-Qaeda, lay down your arms, and reconcile with the Karzai government. That then led to a discussion period, and a lot of things came out in that discussion period. But just to give you the highlights, about 5 important questions emerged. First was what do the American people want? And I breathed a small sigh of relief there about the fact that they're still cutting us some slack between our people and our government, even though we had re-elected that same government. And I said what the American people want is peace in the region with democratically stable governments in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they said, why is America attacking Islam? And I said, America's not attacking Islam, and went into the business of past interventions on behalf of Muslims. And they said, why is the United States attacking Afghanistan? I said, to put it in terms that you value quite deeply, hospitality, loyalty, and revenge. I said, before we recognized certain members of al-Qaeda as a threat, we welcomed them into our country. We gave them hospitality. Then without warning, they struck. We wanted revenge. So we went to the Taliban government at the time and asked them to turn over the al-Qaeda leadership so we could bring them to justice. They refused, so we attacked. I said, but we did so with a heavy heart, because many Americans feel great admiration and respect for the Afghan people, stemming from our common struggle against the former Soviet Union. I said, it's also important for you to recognize that some of your tribal leaders are now banding together to attack al-Qaeda because they violated your hospitality as well. So then we moved on to why is the United States attacking Iraq? And I indicated there was some debate about that, but just to keep things moving, I said, as far as I'm concerned, that too is a matter of revenge, because Saddam Hussein had attempted to assassinate a U.S. president. And we finally got to the last major question, which is why the United States supports Israel. And I said, well, the U.S. has a strategic relationship with Israel that isn't going to change anytime soon. I said, but what is changing is our understanding of, compassion for, and support of the Palestinian people. I said, over time, that's going to make a difference. So then we broke for prayer, and came back and formed a smaller group and came up with a confidence-building measure, which called for establishing a secure area in the western third of Nuristan, which is the province in Afghanistan, which most of them came from, and that's over in this area here, and to facilitate private development coming in. Why that's so important is despite the billions of dollars that have flowed into Afghanistan, hardly anything has changed at the village level. It all gets siphoned off by the government or the warlords. And that was one thing that came out in those deliberations with the Taliban. They hate the warlords, and they have no regard for the Karzai government because he failed to deliver on his promise to rein in the warlords and has not done so. So that's a real attitude problem there. Just see, what else can I tell you about this? Well, the hope is that by facilitating private development, we'll finesse the government, the siphoning off of that aid. So we're pursuing a form of that confidence-building measure right now. But that, engagement with the Taliban later led to an opportunity to intervene in the hostage crisis, of the Korean missionaries that were held hostage by the Taliban. After the second hostage had been killed, both of them were men who had been killed, Doug Coe, who is sort of the key individual behind a National Prayer Breakfast, which is where I get most of my inspiration from, called, and he was sitting there with the Korean ambassador, who also was a member of our Tuesday morning fellowship group, and asked if we could do anything. So we called upon our Deobandi indigenous partner in Pakistan, not lightly, because 6 days earlier, he himself had been the subject of a terrorist attack. Even though his family is very influential and has significant influence over all 650 Deobandi madrasas in Baluchistan, which is the hot zone of Pakistan, butting the Iranian and Afghan borders, right in this area here. And so rather than leaving the country, these terrorists had pumped bullets into the back seat of his car thinking he was there. It was dark. He had been there until a minute earlier, so he just narrowly missed this. Most people in that situation leave the country and let things settle down a bit. He didn't. His wife was expecting, so he just hunkered down in his madrasa. And so 6 days later, he gets this phone call from us asking if he could do something to go in. So what he did was he recruited some local Pakistani religious leaders, but also some Afghan religious leaders. Now, the Pakistani ones had come from Afghanistan before, so they still had lingering influence there, but he recruited people who were known to have some kind of relationship with the two spokesmen for the captors. They went in, they formed an informal jirga. In Afghanistan, instead of a parliament, you have a jirga. And a jirga is a term for, a respected body of elders who have decision-making authority. So you can have jirgas at many levels. Well, this was an informal, ad hoc religious jirga that went in. They went in with open Qurans, set down at the table. Now, these, the captors had already killed 2 people, so there was a little trepidation there as well. But they opened the Qurans, and within the first hour they said, "When are you going to release the women?" So it was so clearly against their religious tenets. They spent a week making that case as best they could in every way possible. But then they left. Everybody was sick as a dog from the local water. But before they did, they extracted 3 concessions. One was that no further harm would come to the hostages while negotiations were going on. 2 was that the captors would release 4 to 5 women as a sign of good intent. And 3rd, and by the way, I think something like 18 out of the 21 hostages were women, so that was the bulk of the constituent group. And the 3rd thing they agreed to was to engage with the Korean delegation that up until that time they had not made contact with. So they met with the Koreans and you know, as we did, we tried very hard to inform that Korean delegation of the willingness of the captors to release 4 to 5 women. But they always hung up on us. And that was despite the fact that the Korean ambassador knew what we were doing every step of the way. But we were sort of the informal, unofficial, offline Track 2 effort that the government of Korea wasn't terribly mindful of. There's a lot of politics at play in this sort of thing. And one has to be concerned about how one's good efforts are being interpreted or misinterpreted. So, long story short, we were not able to tell them that. So when the Koreans met with them, the Koreans asked them to release those who were sick. Well, only 2 were sick, so only 2 were released. So you could say, you know, 2 or 3 were left on the table, as it were. After 6 days, those negotiations broke down. So we reconstituted the nucleus of that jirga that we had formed earlier, and we complemented that with 3 other people we were able to make contact with through back channels. One was, 3 of these were former cabinet officials in the Taliban government. One was the former Minister of Defense, the other one was former Minister of Finance, and then a third. And they had huge influence. And they went in, spent another week, and then the hostages were released. Now, along the way, there was a rumor that the Korean government had paid some ransom. And I don't know for certain. I suspect they probably did, but the rumors ran wild, you know, like $20 million. And if they did do it, it was something under $1 million. I know that. But it was clear, 2 things were very clear. The captors were not really in charge. Somebody higher was, you know, they were doing the bidding of higher authority. We thought at first that it was Al-Qaeda. Later came to think it was more likely the Pakistani intelligence service, who manipulates a lot of things over there. And we had more than casual reason to suspect that. But I think one of the important factors I should probably also mention is that during those initial negotiations, the captors mentioned several times how upset they were that the government of Afghanistan was holding in prison women who were innocent. And these were women, I think, who were guilty by association. You know, they had been married to Taliban who were either being pursued or captured, had already been captured. And so that caused me to go to the Korean ambassador and say, look, why don't you visit the ambassador of Afghanistan and suggest to him that they take 3 weeks to determine the guilt or innocence of the women in prison, and then let the innocent ones go. You would not have been negotiating with terrorists. You would simply be doing what you should do anyway, only faster. And this would be a symbol that would weigh very well with the captors. And so some of that was attempted. But the captors were, some of them wanted to release all the prisoners because of the religious principles. Some wanted to negotiate something in return, and others just simply wanted to kill them. So, you know, if there was a ransom paid, there were some of the captors who denied that throughout and would have been very embarrassed were it to be the case. Anyway, let me conclude by just saying the following. You know, just as setting a counterfire can sometimes be a good antidote for a blaze that's raging out of control, I submit to you that religious reconciliation has that same potential with respect to religious extremism. And as I've heard Chris say on more than one occasion, you know, the best antidote for bad theology is good theology. But this business of making religion part of the solution is not without its challenges either. You know, it requires a certain set of skills. It's physically, emotionally, psychologically draining, and it carries with it some real risks. You know, more than one spiritually motivated peacemaker has paid the ultimate price. But I submit to you that despite the risks, and despite whatever discomfort one might feel in navigating the relatively uncharted waters of spiritual engagement, the stakes are simply too high for us not